Wealthy hotel magnate Jonathan Pierce goes undercover as a janitor to investigate his struggling five-star establishment. But when he defends a hungry boy from his ruthless manager, his mission takes an unexpected turn, one that will change his life forever. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The evening sun cast long shadows across the gleaming marble floor of the Grand Imperial Hotel. Jonathan Pierce adjusted the grey janitor's uniform that felt strange against his skin. At 45, he was used to custom-tailored suits that cost more than what most of his employees made in a month. Tonight, however, he looked like any other maintenance worker in the five-star establishment he actually owned. "Remember, sir, I'll be in the security office if you need anything," whispered Frank, his head of security and the only person who knew about tonight's undercover mission. Jonathan nodded. 2 hours. That's all I need. Frank glanced nervously at his watch. "The executive meeting ends at 9. If anyone recognizes you—" "They won't," Jonathan said firmly. "Most of these people look through maintenance staff like they're invisible. That's exactly what I'm counting on." For years, Jonathan had run his hotel empire from the top floor of his corporate headquarters, trusting his managers to maintain the Pierce standard of excellence. But lately, customer reviews had been slipping at what was supposed to be his flagship location. Complaints about staff attitude, cleanliness issues, and poor service had begun to pile up. His board suggested firing people, but Jonathan wanted to see the problems for himself. He pushed his cleaning cart down the hallway, keeping his head down as guests in expensive clothes walked past him without a second glance. He had already discovered several issues: dirty corners in the lobby bathroom, a broken ice machine that had clearly been out of service for days despite reports saying otherwise, and now he was heading toward the kitchen. That's when he saw the boy. Standing near the service entrance was a small, thin child who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. He wore worn jeans and a t-shirt that was too big for his frame. No shoes. His dark hair needed cutting, and his eyes, large and brown, were fixed on the dining room where servers were clearing away half-eaten plates from the evening buffet. Jonathan slowed his cart, watching as the child's gaze followed a tray of untouched desserts being wheeled into the kitchen. The boy's hand instinctively went to his stomach. "Hey, you!" The sharp voice cut through the elegant background music. Richard Blackwood, the hotel manager Jonathan had hired personally 2 years, Faisu stormed across the lobby, his face twisted with disgust. "What are you doing here?" Richard demanded, glaring down at the boy. The child took a step back. I was just looking. You don't belong here." Richard grabbed the boy's arm roughly. "Get out before I call security." Something inside Jonathan snapped. He had seen enough. "Let him go," he said, stepping forward and abandoning his cart. Richard barely glanced his way. "Mind your business, this street rat—" "I said let him go." Jonathan's voice was calm but carried weight, the same tone he used in boardrooms when million-dollar deals hung in the balance. The manager turned, eyes narrowing as he took in the janitor's uniform. "Who do you think you are, some janitor? Stay out of this if you want to keep your job." Jonathan pulled off his cap, revealing his face fully. The color drained from Richard's face. "Sir?" he stammered, immediately releasing the boy's arm. Jonathan's piercing gaze locked onto him. "So this is how you treat people in my hotel?" Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. Several guests had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Jonathan turned to the little boy. "What's your name?" "Oliver," the child whispered, rubbing his arm where Richard had grabbed him. Jonathan knelt down to the boy's level. "Are you hungry, Oliver?" The boy nodded hesitantly. "Then let's get you some food." He looked at the stunned hotel staff who had gathered nearby. "And make it the best meal this hotel has to offer." 20 minutes later, Jonathan sat across from Oliver in a private dining room usually reserved for celebrities and dignitaries. The boy ate carefully at first, then with growing enthusiasm as he realized nobody was going to take the food away. "Where are your parents, Oliver?" Jonathan asked gently. The boy swallowed a bite of chicken. "My mum's sick. She works at the laundry place across the street. We live in the apartment building behind it." "And she knows you're here?" Oliver looked down at his plate. "She fell asleep after her medicine. I got hungry and there's nothing at home until payday." Jonathan felt a tightness in his chest. The laundry service across the street was one of the businesses that washed the hotel's linens. They paid minimum wage for backbreaking work. "What's your mom's name?" Jonathan asked. Sarah Cooper." A hotel security guard appeared at the doorway. "Mr. Pierce, we've contacted child services as Mr. Blackwood suggested." Jonathan's expression hardened. "Cancel that call immediately." He turned back to Oliver, who looked suddenly frightened. "Don't worry, you're not in any trouble." "Are they going to take me away from my mom?" The fork in his small hand trembled. "No," Jonathan said firmly. "I promise." After Oliver finished eating, Jonathan walked him home to the rundown apartment building behind the laundry service. The contrast with the luxury of his hotel just a block away was jarring. Oliver led him to a third-floor apartment with peeling paint on the door. Inside, a young woman lay sleeping on a worn couch. Even in sleep, her face showed signs of exhaustion. An orange prescription bottle sat on the coffee table next to a glass of water. "Mom?" Oliver gently shook her shoulder. "Mom, wake up." Sarah. Cooper's eyes fluttered open, then widened in panic when she realized her son wasn't alone. She sat up quickly. "Oliver, where did you—" She froze when she saw Jonathan, immediately taking in his janitor's uniform with confusion. "Who are you?" "My name is Jonathan Pierce. I own the Grand Imperial Hotel." Sarah's expression changed from confusion to fear. "Oliver, did you go to the hotel? I've told you never to go there." She turned to Jonathan. "I'm so sorry if he caused any trouble. He's just a child. He doesn't understand." "Your son didn't cause any trouble," Jonathan interrupted gently. "But I think we need to talk." The next morning, Richard Blackwood was called to the executive office at 7 a.m. sharp. He found Jonathan sitting behind the desk, wearing one of his impeccable suits once again, but with an expression colder than Richard had ever seen. "Sir, about last night I can explain." "No need," Jonathan said, sliding a folder across the desk. "You're fired, effective immediately. Your severance package is in there, contingent upon you signing a non-disclosure agreement." Richard's face flushed red. "Because of some dirty street kid? Do you know what would happen if we let every hungry child in the door? We'd be overrun." Jonathan stood slowly. "That dirty street kid is the son of a woman who works herself to exhaustion making sure your hotel has clean sheets. And starting today, Sarah Cooper is our new community outreach coordinator." "You're replacing me with a laundry worker?" Richard sputtered. "No," Jonathan replied coolly. "I'm replacing you with someone who understands compassion. As for Sarah, she'll be developing our new community program. Every night, instead of throwing away unused food from our buffet, we'll be donating it to the local shelter." Richard stormed out, and Jonathan walked to the window overlooking the city. His assistant, Megan, appeared in the doorway. "The renovation crew is ready to start on the Cooper apartment, and the doctor arrived to check on Ms. Cooper's health condition," she reported. "Good," Jonathan nodded. "And the temporary housing arrangements?" "The two-bedroom suite on the 8th floor is prepared for them until their apartment is finished." Jonathan smiled. "Thank you, Megan." "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, why go to such lengths for these particular people?" Jonathan thought about the frightened look in Oliver's eyes, the same look he remembered from his own childhood, before his adoption by the wealthy Pierce family, when he too had known hunger. "Because wealth isn't about money," he said quietly. "It's about the lives you choose to change." 2 weeks later, Sarah sat across from Jonathan in his office. The medication for her chronic condition was working, and color had returned to her face. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "The apartment renovations, the job, the doctor, it's like a dream." Jonathan smiled. "Your program ideas for the community outreach are impressive. You've earned this position." Still, Sarah hesitated. "People are talking about why you would help Oliver and me this way." "Let them talk," Jonathan replied, as he. Sarah left. His assistant brought in the afternoon mail. Among the stack was an invitation to the annual charity gala hosted by Victoria Winters, his ex-wife and the owner of the rival Winters Hotel chain. Jonathan stared at the gold-embossed card. Victoria had left him 5 years ago when his business was struggling, only to marry his former business partner a month later. Now they ran the company that was his biggest competition. The phone on his desk rang. It was Frank, his security chief. "Sir, you should know that Richard Blackwood just accepted a position as general manager at the Winters Grand Hotel." Jonathan put down the invitation. "Interesting timing." "There's more," Frank continued. "I've heard rumors that Victoria is planning something big to try to damage your hotel's reputation before the International Hotel Awards next month." Jonathan thought of Sarah and Oliver, now safely settled into their temporary suite while their apartment was being renovated. He thought of the community program taking shape that would help dozens of families like theirs. "Let her try." Said, "We have something her hotel chain will never have." "What's that, sir?" Jonathan smiled. "Heart." As he hung up, he didn't notice Victoria herself watching his hotel from her office across town, a calculating smile on her perfectly made-up face. "Enjoy your little charity project, Jonathan," she murmured. "It'll be the last one you can afford after I'm done with you." The war between the two hotel chains was about to begin. 1 month had passed since Jonathan Pierce had found Oliver at his hotel. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Grand Imperial's executive dining room as Jonathan watched Oliver devour a stack of pancakes. The boy had gained weight, his cheeks fuller now, his eyes brighter. "Slow down, Sarah," Cooper said with a gentle smile. "The food isn't going anywhere." Since moving into the temporary suite in the hotel, both Sarah and Oliver had transformed. Sarah's new medication had her chronic fatigue under control, and the dark circles under her eyes had faded. Her brown hair, once limp from exhaustion, now had a healthy shine, and she carried herself with growing confidence. "But Mom, I'm going to be late for school," Oliver protested, his mouth full. "Chew first, then talk," she reminded him. Jonathan couldn't help but smile. In just a few weeks, Sarah had proven herself invaluable. The community outreach program was already making headlines in local papers, and hotel guests were responding positively to the initiative. "The renovations on your apartment should be finished by next week," Jonathan said, checking his phone. "My contractor says they're just waiting on the kitchen cabinets." Sarah set down her coffee cup. "Jonathan, I don't know how we'll ever repay you." "You already are," he replied. "The program you developed has improved our public image significantly. Bookings are up 15%. "Still," Sarah began, but was interrupted by Megan, Jonathan's assistant, rushing into the dining room. "Sir, there's something you need to see." She handed him a tablet with the morning news pulled up. Jonathan's face darkened as he read the headline, "Pierce Hotels Facing Health Code Violations." The article featured quotes from anonymous sources claiming that several guests had fallen ill after staying at the Grand Imperial. "That's not true," Sarah exclaimed, reading over his shoulder. "We've had no reports of any illness." "No, we haven't," Jonathan agreed, his voice tight. "But Victoria Winters has friends at the health department who could easily be persuaded to schedule a surprise inspection." Oliver looked up from his pancakes. "Who's Victoria?" Jonathan hesitated, glancing at the boy. "She's someone who used to be important to me. Now she runs a competing hotel chain." "She's his ex-wife," Megan added bluntly, "and she's been trying to ruin him ever since she left him for his former business partner." Sarah's eyes widened. "The woman who married your business partner, that seems calculated." Jonathan finished for her. "Victoria has always been strategic in her relationships." His phone rang. The health department was indeed requesting an immediate inspection. As he took the call, Megan whispered to Sarah, she left him when his business was struggling, then married James Winters a month later, along with his client list and business plans. Sarah's expression softened with sympathy as she watched Jonathan end the call. "I need to handle this," he said, standing up. "Sarah, can you make sure Oliver gets to school?" "Of course," she replied. "And Jonathan, don't worry, the truth will come out." By noon, the Grand Imperial was swarming with health inspectors. Jonathan knew most of them from previous routine inspections, but today they were led by a stern-faced woman he'd never met before. "Margaret Thornton," she introduced herself coldly. "Head inspector." Jonathan recognized the name immediately. Margaret had been Victoria's college roommate. The connection was not a coincidence. For 3 hours, the inspectors combed through every corner of the hotel. Jonathan followed them, watching as Margaret scrutinized surfaces with exaggerated care, making notes at the slightest imperfection. Your kitchen ventilation system is outdated, she declared, though it had passed inspection just 2 months earlier. The temperature in your walk-in refrigerator is half a degree too warm, she noted, ignoring the chef's explanation about the shutter being opened repeatedly for their inspection. By the time they left, Margaret handed Jonathan a list of violations that would cost thousands to address. And worse, she placed a conditional rating on the hotel's health certificate, something that would have to be disclosed to all incoming guests. Frank found Jonathan in his office, staring out the window at the city skyline. "Sir, our lawyers think we can fight this. The inspection was clearly biased." "That will take weeks," Jonathan replied. "By then, the damage will be done." Frank hesitated. "There's something else. We found this in one of the guest rooms." He placed a small electronic device on the desk. "It's a transmitter, designed to interfere with our air purification system. It releases small amounts of irritants into the air." Jonathan picked up the device. "Enough to make someone sneeze or feel ill." "Exactly. And guess who checked out of that room yesterday? One of the anonymous sources quoted in today's news story." Jonathan's jaw tightened. Victoria wasn't just spreading rumors, she was manufacturing evidence. "Find out who placed this device," he ordered, "and check every room." That evening, Jonathan retreated to his penthouse apartment at the top of the hotel. He rarely used it, preferring his house outside the city, but tonight he needed to stay close. A knock at the door surprised him. When he opened it, Sarah stood there with a covered dish. "You missed dinner," she said simply. Oliver was worried. Jonathan stepped back to let her in, touched by the gesture. The aroma of home-cooked food filled the air as she set the dish on the counter. "You cooked this?" Sarah nodded. "The head chef let me use a corner of the kitchen. It's just a simple beef stew, but my mother always said good food helps clear the mind." As they sat at his rarely used dining table, Jonathan found himself telling Sarah things he'd never shared with anyone. About growing up poor before being adopted by the wealthy Pierce family, about building his hotel empire from nothing, and about Victoria. "I thought she loved me," he admitted, "but she loved the lifestyle, not the man. When things got difficult, she made her choice." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Her loss," she said simply. The unexpected touch sent warmth through Jonathan's chest. There was something about Sarah, an authenticity that Victoria had never possessed. Their moment was interrupted by Jonathan's phone. Frank needed to see him immediately. In the security office, Frank played surveillance footage from earlier that day. It clearly showed one of the newer housekeepers entering a guest room that wasn't on her cleaning schedule, staying for exactly 2 minutes, then leaving. "We found 3 more of those devices," Frank reported, "all in rooms where guests later complained of feeling unwell." Jonathan recognized the housekeeper. She had been hired just 2 weeks ago. "Have HR pull her employment records. I want to know if she has any connection to Winter's Hotels." The next morning, the evidence was undeniable. The housekeeper had previously worked at Victoria's flagship hotel. More damning still, phone records showed calls between her and Richard Blackwood, the manager Jonathan had fired. Armed with this information, Jonathan confronted the health department, demanding a new inspection with different personnel. The devices were turned over to the police as evidence of corporate sabotage. By evening, Victoria's plan was unraveling. The news outlets that had run the original story were now reporting on the apparent setup. The health department, facing potential scandal, quickly backpedaled and restored the Grand Imperial's perfect rating. Jonathan should have felt victorious, but the incident had revealed just how far Victoria would go to destroy him. This wasn't just business competition, it was personal. As he walked through the hotel lobby, he noticed a stunning woman in a red dress stepping out of a luxury car. His heart sank as he recognized Victoria Winters. With her perfectly styled, blonde hair and calculating smile, she looked as beautiful and dangerous as the day she'd walked out on him. "Jonathan," she purred, air kissing his cheek as if they were old friends, "your hotel looks quaint." "What do you want, Victoria?" he asked coolly, aware of the staff watching them. "Can't an old friend pay a visit?" Her eyes scanned the lobby. "I heard about your new charity case. The cleaning woman and her son, people are talking, you know." Before Jonathan could respond, Oliver came bounding across the lobby. "Mr. Pierce, look what I got on my math test." The boy proudly held up a paper with a big red A. Victoria's eyebrows rose as she watched Jonathan's face soften as he examined. "The test. That's excellent, Oliver," Jonathan said warmly. "Where's your mum?" "Right here," Sarah replied, approaching from the direction of her office. She stopped short when she saw Victoria, immediately sensing who she was. Victoria's gaze swept over Sarah, taking in her simple but professional attire and natural beauty. Something flickered in Victoria's eyes. Recognition of a threat she hadn't anticipated. "Sarah Cooper, this is Victoria Winters," Jonathan made the introduction reluctantly. "The ex-wife," Sarah said with a tight smile, extending her hand. "I've heard about you." Victoria ignored the outstretched hand. "Charming. Jonathan always did have a weakness for projects." Oliver looked confused. "What's a project?" Jonathan placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "Nothing important. Why don't you go show your mom your test?" As Sarah led Oliver away, she glanced back at Jonathan with concern in her eyes. Victoria's smile turned predatory. "She's in love with you, you know. So transparent." Jonathan felt a rush of anger. "Why are you really here, Victoria?" "The International Hotel Awards are next month," she replied, examining her manicured nails. "Only one hotel in the city can win Best Luxury Experience. For 5 years, it's been mine. And this year, it won't be," Jonathan said confidently. Victoria laughed. "Your little health code stunt didn't work, but I have other plans. I just wanted to see the look on your face when you realize you've lost again." "You're the one who lost, Victoria," Jonathan said quietly. "You lost the chance to be with someone who would have given you everything." Something vulnerable flashed across her face before the cold mask returned. "I have everything I need, except happiness," Jonathan observed. "How is James these days? Still cheating on you with his secretary?" Victoria's smile faltered. "Be careful, Jonathan, you have more to lose now." Her gaze drifted toward the direction Sarah and Oliver had gone. As she turned to leave, Jonathan called after her. "Stay away from them, Victoria. This is between you and me." "Everything you care about is fair game," she replied without turning around. "You should know that by now." Later that night, as Jonathan sat in his office reviewing security protocols, Sarah knocked on his open door. "Oliver's asleep," she said. "He was worried about you after meeting that woman." Jonathan smiled. "Smart kid." "He is," Sarah agreed, sitting across from him. "He also thinks she's the villain from one of his comic books." She hesitated. "He might be right," Jonathan laughed despite himself. "Victoria wasn't always like this. Or maybe she was and I just didn't see it." Sarah studied him. "You really loved her, didn't you?" "I thought I did," Jonathan replied honestly. "Now I'm not sure what it was." Their eyes held for a moment too long. "I should go," Sarah said suddenly, standing. "It's late." "Sarah," Jonathan called as she reached the door. "Thank you for the dinner, for caring." She smiled. "That's what friends do." As she walked away, Jonathan realized that friends didn't quite capture what he was beginning to feel for Sarah Cooper, and that was dangerous for all of them. Across town, Victoria paced in her penthouse office at the Winters Grand Hotel. Her phone rang and she answered immediately. "He has evidence of the devices." Richard Blackwood's nervous voice came through. "The police are involved." "Calm down," Victoria snapped. "The housekeeper won't talk if she knows what's good for her." "And what about me? I did what you asked, placing someone on his staff, spreading those rumors, but corporate sabotage is a crime." Victoria's voice turned icy. "So is embezzlement. Richard, or have you forgotten those creative bookkeeping methods you used at Pierce Hotels? Methods I have proof of?" Richard fell silent. "Don't worry," Victoria continued. "I have a new plan, one that will destroy Jonathan Pierce once and for all." She hung up and walked to the window, looking out at the glittering lights of the city. In the distance, she could see the Grand Imperial Hotel, standing tall and proud. "Enjoy your little family while you can, Jonathan," she whispered, "because soon you'll have nothing." 2 weeks before the International Hotel Awards, the renovations on Sarah and Oliver's apartment were finally complete. Jonathan stood in the middle of the transformed living room, watching as Oliver raced from room to room, exploring his new space with unbridled excitement. "My own bedroom!" the boy shouted, bouncing on the new bed. "And it has stars on the ceiling. That glow in the dark." Sarah walked slowly through the apartment, touching the new furniture with an expression of disbelief. What had once been a cramped, run-down space was now bright and welcoming. The walls were freshly painted in warm colors, the kitchen gleamed with new appliances, and the bathroom had been completely redone. "Jonathan, this is..." She struggled to find words. "It's too much." "It's not enough," he replied quietly. "After what you've done for the hotel, for me." Their eyes met, and that now familiar warmth spread through his chest. Over the past weeks, their friendship had deepened into something neither of them had named yet. Their dinners together had become a nightly routine, and Jonathan found himself looking forward to them more than any business meeting or social event. "I don't know how to thank you," Sarah said. "You don't have to." Jonathan hesitated, then added, "But I was hoping you and Oliver might join me for dinner tomorrow night. There's a charity gala for children's education, and I'd be honored if you'd come as my guests." Sarah's eyes widened. "A gala? Jonathan, I don't have anything to wear to something like that." "Actually," he nodded toward the bedroom, "there might be something in your closet." Sarah hurried to her bedroom and opened the closet door. There, hanging beside her modest work clothes, was an elegant blue evening gown. She reached out to touch the silky fabric, then turned to Jonathan with tears in her eyes. "You thought of everything, didn't you?" Oliver bounded out of his room. "Can we stay here tonight, Mum? Please?" Sarah laughed. "Of course. This is our home. Now, our home." Jonathan felt a pang in his chest at those words. Watching Sarah and Oliver together in this apartment that had become a symbol of their new life, he realized how much he'd come to care for them both. As if reading his thoughts, Sarah crossed the room and hugged him. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." The embrace lasted only moments, but it left Jonathan with a certainty he hadn't felt in years. Whatever was growing between them was real, nothing like what he'd had with Victoria. The next evening, Jonathan paced nervously in the lobby of the Grand Imperial. The charity gala was one of the biggest social events of the season, and he knew Victoria would be there. Bringing Sarah into that world was a risk, but he was tired of hiding his feelings. The elevator doors opened, and conversation in the lobby momentarily stopped. Sarah stepped out in the blue gown that complemented her eyes perfectly. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, and she wore minimal jewelry, just simple pearl earrings Jonathan had left in a box with the dress. "Wow, Mom," Oliver exclaimed from beside her. The boy was dressed in a child-sized tuxedo and looked both uncomfortable and proud. "You look like a princess." Jonathan couldn't agree more. Sarah had always been beautiful to him, even in her work clothes, but tonight she was breathtaking. As she approached, he saw uncertainty in her eyes. "Is it too much?" she asked quietly. "I feel so out of place." "You look perfect," he assured her. "Everyone else will be overdressed." The charity gala was held at the Metropolitan Hall, a historic venue downtown. As Jonathan's limousine pulled up to the red carpet, photographers' flashes lit up the night. Charity events like this one were always heavily covered by social media and local news. "Are those reporters?" Sarah asked nervously. "Just smile and keep walking," Jonathan advised. "They're more interested in the celebrities than in us." But as they stepped out of the car, Jonathan realized he'd underestimated the media's interest. Several photographers immediately recognized him and began calling his name. Questions flew at them from all directions. "Mr. Pierce, who's your date tonight? Is this your new family, Jonathan? How long have you been together?" Oliver gripped his mother's hand tightly as they navigated the camera flashes. Jonathan placed a protective arm around Sarah's shoulders, guiding them quickly into the building. Inside, the hall was transformed into a glittering wonderland. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables adorned with elaborate floral arrangements. A string quartet played softly in one corner, and well-dressed waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. "This is incredible," Sarah breathed, taking it all in. "It's stuffy," Oliver declared with a child's honesty, tugging at his bow tie. Jonathan laughed. "I couldn't agree more, but it's for a good cause." He led them to their table near the front of the room. Around them, the elite, of the city chatted and networked, occasionally glancing curiously in their direction. Jonathan introduced Sarah to several business associates and charitable foundation directors, proud of how quickly she engaged them in conversation about the Grand Imperial's community outreach program. Across the room, Victoria Winters made her entrance on the arm of her husband James. She wore a dramatic red gown that seemed designed to draw every eye in the room. When she spotted Jonathan with Sarah and Oliver, her smile faltered for just a moment before returning with a predatory edge. "She's coming this way," Sarah murmured, having followed Jonathan's gaze. "Just be yourself," he said quietly. "That's more than enough." Victoria glided toward them, pulling a reluctant-looking James along. "Jonathan, darling, what a surprise to see you here. These events are usually so exclusive." "Victoria," Jonathan nodded coolly. "You remember Sarah Cooper, our community outreach coordinator, and her son Oliver?" Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly at the word "our," as if sensing Jonathan's possessiveness. "So of course, the cleaning woman." "Former cleaning woman," Sarah corrected with a polite smile. "Now I run a program that's helped over 200 families in the community. We're being featured in next month's Business and Humanity magazine." Victoria's perfect smile tightened. "How charitable of you, Jonathan. Always picking up strays." Oliver looked up at Victoria with innocent curiosity. "Are you the lady from the comic books?" "Excuse me?" Victoria asked, confused. "The villain," Oliver explained seriously. "The one who's always trying to hurt people." James Winters choked on his champagne while Jonathan tried unsuccessfully to hide his smile. Sarah placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. "Oliver, that's not polite," she said, though her eyes sparkled with suppressed laughter. Victoria's face flushed with anger. "You should teach your child some manners before bringing him into civilized society." Before Sarah could respond, a photographer approached their group. "Could I get a picture of the hotel rivals together? Great publicity for the charity." Reluctantly, Jonathan and Victoria posed side by side, their respective partners flanking them. As the camera flashed, Victoria whispered, "Enjoy playing house. While you can, Jonathan. After the hotel awards, your little fantasy family will see you for what you really are, a failure." The evening progressed with speeches and a charity auction. Throughout the night, Jonathan noticed how naturally Sarah fit into this world, despite her nervousness. She spoke passionately about education initiatives to anyone who would listen, and even Oliver charmed several major donors with his earnest questions about how the money would help other kids. As the night drew to a close, Jonathan found himself watching Sarah across the room as she chatted with the head of the Education Foundation. Something in his chest tightened at the sight of her animated face, her genuine smile, the way she gestured expressively when talking about something she cared about. "She's quite something," came a voice beside him. Jonathan turned to find James Winters, Victoria's husband, standing there with a drink in hand. "She is," Jonathan agreed cautiously. James sighed. "Victoria's obsessed with destroying you, you know. Ever since you fired that manager." "What was his name?" "Richard Blackwood." "Right, he's been feeding her information, filling her head with ideas about how to take you down." James looked tired, the lines around his eyes more pronounced than Jonathan remembered. "Just thought you should know." "Why are you telling me this?" Jonathan asked. James glanced across the room to where Victoria was holding court with a group of socialites. "Let's just say, not all marriages are as picture-perfect as they seem." With that cryptic comment, he walked away. Later that night, as the limousine carried them back to Sarah's apartment, Oliver fell asleep with his head in his mother's lap. Sarah gently stroked his hair, a tender smile on her face. "He had a wonderful time," she said softly, "despite the bow-tie torture." Jonathan laughed. "He did great, especially that comic book villain comment." Sarah groaned. "I could have died." But the look on Victoria's face. They both dissolved into laughter, trying to keep quiet so as not to wake Oliver. When they arrived at the apartment building, Jonathan insisted on walking them to their door. Sarah carried a sleeping Oliver, who had grown heavy in her arms. "Let me," Jonathan said, gently taking the boy from her. Oliver barely stirred as Jonathan carried him into the apartment and laid him carefully on his bed. In the living room, Sarah had kicked off her high heels and was rubbing her feet. "I don't know how people dance in those all night. You were amazing tonight," Jonathan said, sitting beside her on the couch. Everyone was impressed. "I was terrified," she admitted. "All those important people, Victoria watching my every move." "You couldn't tell you're a natural." Sarah shook her head. "Hardly, but thank you for giving me the chance to see that world." Their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to thicken. Jonathan reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "Sarah," he began, his voice low, "these past weeks, having you and Oliver in my life, I haven't been this happy in years." Sarah's breath caught. "Jonathan," before she could finish, his phone rang. Jonathan silently cursed the interruption, but answered when he saw it was Frank, his head of security. "Sir, there's been an incident at the hotel," Frank said urgently. "A water pipe burst on the top floor. The penthouse and 3 guest suites are flooded." Jonathan stood immediately. "I'll be right there." He hung up and turned to Sarah. "I'm sorry, I have to go. There's an emergency at the hotel." She nodded, understanding but clearly disappointed. "Of course, go." At the door, he turned back. "Sarah, what I was trying to say, I care about you, about both of you, more than I expected to." A slow smile spread across her face. "We care about you too." The moment hung between them, full of promise, before Jonathan reluctantly left. At the hotel, Jonathan discovered that the burst pipe was actually sabotage. Someone had deliberately damaged the waterline, causing thousands of dollars in damage. Security footage showed a maintenance worker who didn't belong to their staff accessing the utility room hours earlier. "The face is blurred," Frank pointed, out on the screen. "They knew where the cameras were." "This has Victoria written all over it," Jonathan said grimly. The next morning, as cleanup crews worked to repair the damage, Megan rushed into Jonathan's office with a tablet in hand. "Sir, you need to see this." She handed him the device, open to a society news page. The headline read, "Hotel Magnate's Charity Case, the truth about Jonathan Pierce's new family." Below was a photo from the charity gala. Jonathan, with his arm around Sarah, and Oliver standing in front of them, looking every bit like a family unit. The article painted Sarah as a gold digger who had manipulated her way from cleaning lady to executive by seducing the lonely hotel owner. "It gets worse," Megan said, scrolling down to reveal more photos, older ones showing Sarah entering Jonathan's penthouse at night and leaving in the morning, taken out of context from the dinner she had brought him after the health inspection incident. Jonathan felt sick. "Get our PR team on this immediately and call Sarah. She needs to be prepared." But Sarah was already on her way to his office, her face pale. When she arrived, her eyes were filled with hurt and anger. "How could they write these things that I'm using you, that I—" She couldn't even finish the sentence. "It's Victoria," Jonathan said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "She's trying to hurt me through you." Sarah sank into a chair. Oliver's school called. Some of the parents saw the article. They're suggesting that maybe he shouldn't attend their exclusive institution anymore. Jonathan pounded his fist on the desk. This has gone too far. "What are we going to do?" Sarah asked, looking more vulnerable than he'd seen her since that first night with Oliver. Jonathan took her hands in his. "First, we fight back with the truth. Then we make sure Victoria Winters never hurts anyone again." Across town, Victoria smiled at the morning headlines on her tablet. In her office at the Winters Grand Hotel, she met with Richard Blackwood and a man in an expensive suit. "Everything is proceeding as planned," she told them. "The sabotage, the scandal. Jonathan Pierce's reputation is crumbling just days before the hotel awards." "And you're sure this will work?" Richard asked nervously. "He's survived our other attempts." "Because we were attacking his business," Victoria said. "This time we're attacking his heart." She turned to the suited man. "You have the documents?" He nodded, placing a folder on her desk. "Everything you asked for. Financial records, movement of funds, offshore accounts, all traceable back to Pierce if examined in the right light." Victoria's smile widened. "Perfect. By this time next week, Jonathan Pierce won't just lose the hotel award, he'll lose everything. His hotel, his reputation." She picked up the gossip magazine with Sarah and Oliver's picture. and his precious new family. The man in the suit looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Winters, framing someone for financial crimes is serious. If this is discovered—" "It won't be," Victoria said firmly. "Not until it's too late." Little did Victoria know her conversation was being recorded by a small device hidden beneath her desk, placed there by James Winters himself the night before. The week before the International Hotel Awards was the most challenging of Jonathan Pierce's life. The gossip about Sarah had spread like wildfire through the city's elite circles. Some of Jonathan's oldest business associates were suddenly too busy to take his calls, and several corporate clients had quietly moved their reservations to other hotels. Sarah sat at her desk in the community outreach office, trying to focus on work, while ignoring the whispers and stares from hotel staff who had read the scandalous articles. Though Jonathan had issued a strong statement defending her character and threatened legal action against the publications, the damage was done. Oliver had come home from school in tears yesterday. The other children had repeated cruel things they'd heard their parents say about his mother. It had taken hours to calm him down, with Jonathan sitting patiently on the edge of the boy's bed, telling him stories until he finally fell asleep. A gentle knock on her office door pulled Sarah from her thoughts. Jonathan stood there, looking more tired than she'd ever seen him. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. Sarah nodded, watching as he closed the door behind him and took a seat across from her desk. "I just got off the phone with my lawyers," he said. "There's been a new development and it's not good." Sarah's heart sank. "What now?" "The Financial Regulatory Commission has opened an investigation into the hotel's finances." Jonathan ran a hand through his hair. "They're claiming there are irregularities in our accounts, specifically money being funneled through offshore companies." "That's ridiculous," Sarah exclaimed. "You would never—" "Of course not," Jonathan agreed. "But someone has gone to great lengths to make it look like I did." Sarah didn't need to ask who that someone was. "Victoria. It has her fingerprints all over it." "The timing is too perfect, 3 days before the hotel awards." Jonathan leaned forward. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." She tensed. "Of course. Are you and Oliver okay with all of this? The gossip, the stares, the accusations. It's unfair that you've been dragged into my war with Victoria." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Oliver is struggling," she admitted. "He doesn't understand why people are saying such horrible things about us." Jonathan nodded, pain evident in his eyes. "I was afraid of that. Maybe it would be better for both of you if you distanced yourselves from me, at least until this blows over." "Is that what you want?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "God, no," Jonathan replied immediately. "The thought of not having you and Oliver in my life." He shook his head. "But I care about you too much to keep putting you through this." Sarah stood and walked around her desk. She sat on the edge, directly in front of him. "Jonathan Pierce, do you think so little of me that you believe I'd abandon you when things get difficult?" Relief flooded his face. "I hoped you wouldn't." "You changed our lives," she said firmly. "You believed in me when no one else would. You gave Oliver hope and stability. We're not going anywhere." Jonathan reached for her hands. "Sir, Sarah, The office door burst open and Frank rushed in. "Sir, there's someone here you need to see." Jonathan started to protest the interruption but stopped when he saw who was standing behind Frank. James Winters. Victoria's husband looked distinctly uncomfortable, clutching a slim briefcase to his chest and glancing nervously over his shoulder. "I need to talk to you," James said urgently. "In private?" Jonathan hesitated, looking at Sarah. "It's okay," she assured him. "We can finish our conversation later." In Jonathan's office, James paced anxiously while Jonathan watched him with wary curiosity. "She's gone too far this time," James finally said. "Victoria, she's not just trying to beat you at business anymore, she's trying to destroy you completely." "I'm aware," Jonathan replied dryly. James placed his briefcase on the desk and opened it. Inside was a small recording device and a flash drive. Last night, Victoria met with Richard Blackwood and a man named Curtis Donovan. He's a financial fraud expert who used to work for the SEC before he was quietly asked to resign for taking bribes. James tapped the recording device. "I recorded everything." Jonathan stared at the items. "Why are you doing this?" James sank into a chair, suddenly looking exhausted. Because I didn't sign up for this. Competition is one thing, criminal conspiracy is another. He hesitated. And because she's been having an affair with Richard for months, the same man who's been helping her try to frame you. Jonathan pressed play on the recording device. Victoria's voice filled the room, outlining her plan to plant false financial records that would trigger a government investigation. She spoke of bribing officials, falsifying documents, and leaking information to the press. Once the commission freezes his assets, we'll make our offer to buy the Grand Imperial at a fraction of its value, Victoria's recorded voice said. By the time his name is cleared, if it ever is, the hotel awards will be long over, and the Pierce Hotel brand will be worthless. Jonathan listened in stunned silence. When the recording ended, he looked at James. Why didn't you come forward sooner? I didn't know how far she was willing to go, James admitted. I thought it was just business rivalry until I overheard her talking about having those devices planted in your hotel rooms. That's when I started recording her meetings. And now I want out of the marriage, of the business partnership, all of it. James nodded at the flash drive. That contains copies of all the falsified documents Victoria created, financial records. She planted emails she fabricated in your name, everything. It should be enough to clear you and implicate her. Jonathan studied the man before him. You realize this will destroy her. She destroyed herself, James said quietly. And she would have destroyed you too. After James left, Jonathan immediately called his legal team. Within hours, they had reviewed the evidence and begun proceedings to clear his name. The Financial Regulatory Commission was presented with proof of the conspiracy, and by evening, news was breaking about Victoria Winter's fraudulent scheme. Jonathan tried repeatedly to reach Sarah, wanting to share the news that the worst was over, but she wasn't answering her phone. Finally, he decided to go to her apartment, needing to see her face when he told her they were going to be okay. When he arrived, he was surprised to find the apartment door slightly ajar. Sarah, he called, pushing it open. Oliver! The apartment was empty, but nothing seemed out of place. On the kitchen counter was a note in Sarah's handwriting, taking Oliver to the park to clear his head. Back soon. Jonathan was about to leave when his phone rang. It was Frank. Sir, Victoria Winters just entered the hotel. She's heading for Sarah's office. Jonathan's blood ran cold. Sarah's not there. Find Victoria immediately and have security. Escort her out. We're trying, Frank replied. But she's not in the building anymore. She was only here for a few minutes and then she left in a hurry. A horrible suspicion formed in Jonathan's mind. He dialed Sarah's number again, and this time he heard a faint ringing coming from the bedroom. He found her phone on the nightstand, along with her purse and keys. Sarah would never leave home without these things, especially not with Oliver. Jonathan called Frank back. I need access to the security cameras near Sarah's apartment now. 20. Minutes later, Jonathan was watching footage that confirmed his worst fears. Victoria's car had pulled up outside the apartment building 2 hours ago. The cameras showed her entering, and 10 minutes later, leaving with a frightened-looking Oliver by her side. There was no sign of Sarah. Where's the nearest park? Jonathan demanded. Frank pulled up a map. There's one 3 blocks from here. Send security there immediately, and keep trying to track Victoria's car. Jonathan raced to his own car, his mind spinning with terrible possibilities. As he started the engine, his phone rang with an unknown number. Hello, he answered urgently. Jonathan. It was Victoria's voice, smooth and controlled. I believe we need to talk. Where are Sarah and Oliver? He demanded. Safe for now, she replied. Sarah wasn't feeling well when I stopped by, so I offered to take Oliver to the park while she rested. Such a sweet boy. He trusts so easily. Jonathan gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Victoria, if you harm that child, don't be dramatic, she interrupted. I'm not a monster. I simply need to have a conversation with you, away from your lawyers and security team. Where? The old boathouse at Lakeside Park. Come alone or I'll disappear with the boy before you can blink. The line went dead. Jonathan texted Frank the location, but instructed him to keep his distance. There was too much at stake to risk Victoria seeing police or security. Lakeside Park was nearly deserted as evening approached. The old boathouse stood at the edge of the water, its weathered boards creaking in the light breeze. Jonathan approached cautiously, every sense alert. Inside, he found Victoria sitting on a bench, her perfect appearance at odds with the dusty surroundings. Oliver sat beside her, looking confused and frightened. "Mr. Pierce," the boy called out, trying to run to him, but Victoria held his arm. "Let him go," Jonathan said, his voice deadly calm. Victoria smiled. "In a moment. First, we need to discuss terms." "Terms?" Jonathan took a step forward. "You're finished, Victoria. Your scheme has been exposed. The authorities have everything. The fake documents, recordings of your meetings, all of it, for the E." First time, Victoria's composure slipped. "What are you talking about?" "James came to me this morning. He gave me everything." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "It's over." Victoria's face paled. "James wouldn't—" "He did. Turns out he doesn't appreciate being cheated on with Richard. Blackwood." Victoria stood abruptly, pulling Oliver with her. "You're lying." "Check the news," Jonathan suggested. "It's breaking as we speak. Your name, your company, it's all going down. The only question is whether kidnapping charges will be added to the list." Victoria's eyes darted around like a cornered animal. "I didn't kidnap anyone. I was just taking the boy to the park." "Where's Sarah?" Jonathan demanded. Victoria's laugh had an edge of hysteria. "Your precious Sarah. Probably still unconscious in her bedroom. Just a little something to help her sleep while Oliver and I had our outing." Jonathan took another step closer. "Let Oliver go, and I'll speak on your behalf. Tell them you cooperated, in the end." "You think I care about that?" Victoria spat. "You've taken everything from me." "How you did this to yourself," Jonathan replied. "Now let the boy go." Oliver suddenly stomped hard on Victoria's foot and wrenched himself free. He ran to Jonathan, who pushed the child behind him protectively. Victoria reached into her purse, and Jonathan tensed, but she merely pulled out her phone. "This isn't over, Jonathan." "It is," came a voice from the doorway. They all turned to see Sarah standing there, her face pale but determined. Behind her were Frank and 2 police officers. "Mom!" Oliver broke free from Jonathan and ran to his mother, who enveloped him in a fierce hug. Victoria looked from Sarah to the police, then back to Jonathan. "How? Your little something to help me sleep wasn't as effective as you thought," Sarah explained. "I woke up just as you were leaving with Oliver. I saw you from the window and followed you here while calling the police. As the officers approached Victoria, she seemed to deflate before their eyes, all her schemes and manipulations finally catching up to her. Victoria Winters, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, corporate sabotage, and attempted kidnapping," one officer recited, handcuffing her. As they led her away, Victoria looked back at Jonathan one last time. "I did love you once," she said softly. "No," Jonathan replied. "You loved what I represented. There's a difference." After giving statements to the police, Jonathan, Sarah, and Oliver returned to Sarah's apartment. Oliver, exhausted from the ordeal but remarkably resilient, fell asleep almost immediately. In the living room, Sarah sat close to Jonathan on the couch. "When I woke up and saw Oliver was gone," she shuddered. "I've never been so scared." Jonathan put his arm around her. "You were amazing, following them, calling the police." "I would do anything for him," Sarah said simply, "just like you would." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments. "It's really over, isn't it?" Sarah asked. "The investigation, Victoria's plots, all of it?" Jonathan nodded. "The Regulatory Commission has already issued a statement clearing me of any wrongdoing. Victoria and Richard will face serious charges. And James," he shrugged, "James will probably start over somewhere new." "And us?" Sarah asked quietly. "What happens now?" Jonathan turned to face her. "That's what I was trying to tell you in your office earlier before we were interrupted." He took both her hands in his. "Sarah Cooper, somewhere between watching you read to a man in a coma and seeing you stand up to my ex-wife to protect your son, I fell in love with you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Jonathan, let me finish," he said gently. "I know this has all happened quickly. I know we come from different worlds, but when I'm with you and Oliver, I feel like I've found something I didn't even know I was looking for. A family, Sarah squeezed his hands. "Oliver adores you, and I—" She took a deep breath. "I love you too. I think I have for a while now." Jonathan leaned forward and kissed her softly. When they parted, they were both smiling. "What about the hotel?" "The awards?" Sarah asked. "They're announcing the winner tomorrow night," Jonathan replied. "But honestly, I don't care anymore. I've already won something far more valuable." The next evening, the Grand Imperial Hotel ballroom was transformed for a viewing party of the International Hotel Awards broadcast. Jonathan had invited all the staff and their families, from executives to housekeepers. The mood was celebratory, regardless of the outcome, as news of Victoria's arrest and the clearing of Jonathan's name had restored the hotel's reputation overnight. Sarah stood beside Jonathan, elegant in a simple green dress, while Oliver sat nearby with some of the staff's children, all of them enjoying the elaborate dessert buffet. "Ladies and gentlemen," the awards presenter announced on the large screen, "the winner of this year's International Hotel Award for Best Luxury Experiences." The room fell silent. The Grand Imperial Hotel. The ballroom erupted in cheers. Staff members hugged each other, some wiping away tears of joy and relief. Jonathan kissed Sarah right there in front of everyone, not caring who saw. As the celebration continued around them, Jonathan led Sarah and Oliver out to the quiet garden terrace. The city lights sparkled below them, and the night air was cool and fresh. "I have something to ask you both," Jonathan said, suddenly looking nervous. He knelt down to Oliver's level. "Oliver, you know I care about you and your mum very much, right?" The boy nodded solemnly. "I was wondering how you would feel if I asked your mum to marry me, if we all became a family officially." Oliver's eyes widened. "For real, like you'd be my dad?" "If that's something you'd want, yes," Jonathan replied. Oliver threw his arms around Jonathan's neck. "Yes. Can we still have pancakes on Sundays?" Jonathan laughed. "Every Sunday." He stood and turned to Sarah, whose eyes were shining with tears. From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. "Sarah Cooper, you showed me what true strength looks like. You reminded me what matters most in life." He opened the box to reveal a stunning but understated diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" Sarah looked from Jonathan to Oliver, who was practically bouncing with excitement and back again. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." As Jonathan slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her close for a kiss, Oliver cheered. 6 months later, the Grand Imperial Hotel garden was transformed for a different kind of celebration. White flowers lined the aisle where Sarah, radiant in a simple lace gown, walked toward Jonathan with Oliver proudly escorting her. The ceremony was small but filled with genuine love and joy. Hotel staff members who had become like family sat, alongside Sarah's friends from her former job, and the community members whose lives had been changed by the outreach program she now directed full-time. As they exchanged vows, Jonathan looked out at the gathering and then back at Sarah and Oliver, his family. He thought about the night he had put on a janitor's uniform, never imagining it would lead him here. Sometimes the greatest treasures were found when you stepped out of your world and into someone else's. Sometimes the richest man wasn't the one with the most money, but the one with the most love. As he kissed his bride, Jonathan Pierce, the boss who had once gone in disguise, knew he had finally found what all his wealth could never buy, a home for his heart. Victoria Winters watched the wedding announcement in the society pages from her apartment, now under house arrest, as her trial approached. The empire she had built was crumbling around her, her reputation in tatters. Yet as she looked at the photo of Jonathan, Sarah, and Oliver, their faces alight with genuine happiness, something shifted inside her. For the first time, she wondered if perhaps she had been pursuing the wrong things all along. Across town, James Winters was packing the last of his belongings into his car. After cooperating with authorities, he had been granted immunity and was starting fresh in another city. As he prepared to drive away, he glanced at the newspaper on the passenger seat, the one with Jonathan and Sarah's wedding photo. He smiled slightly. Sometimes, even in the midst of scandal and betrayal, good things could emerge. Sometimes, the boss in disguise found more than he was looking for. And sometimes a little boy who just wanted dinner ended up with something much more precious. a family built not on wealth or status, but on love, loyalty, and second chances. The end.